Loud. And judges, would you like to introduce yourselves?
I'm Steve Frenzik, retired professor of political science in the U.S. Naval Academy.
Hi, I'm Candida Steele, and I'm retired as a judge on the U.S. Civilian Board of Contract Appeals, and I live in Maine.
I'm Lindsay Draper. I'm retired from the juvenile court bench here in Wauwatosa, Wisconsin.
And would you introduce yourselves?
Good evening. We're the Virginia Wildcard team from Douglas Freeman High School in Henrico County, Virginia. Our instructor's name is Mr. Rob Peck. My name is Taylor Whitfield.
My name is Grayson Horner.
And my name is Russell Nystrom. We're excited to have a conversation today.
Good. We'll be using question number 1. In a letter from Benjamin Lincoln to Daniel Shays, he said, "Disband your deluded followers. Should you attempt to fire upon the troops of government, the consequences might be fatal to many of your men, the least guilty. What useful purpose, if any, have rebellions served throughout American history? Do the events of January 6, 2021 at the U.S. Capitol constitute a rebellion? Why or why not? Are there rebellions in the world today that are justified? Why or why not?" You may begin.
The word rebellion is derived from the Latin root bello, meaning to fight or to war. We can see this in rebellions throughout the world and history, like the Roman Catalan conspiracy, to contemporary examples like the Zumba rebellion in South Africa. The common thread that we see among both of these rebellions is a sense of bello, or aggressively confronting an authority or an idea.
In American history, we have seen much of the same, with rebellions like the Civil War, the Whiskey Rebellion, Nat Turner's Rebellion, and numerous others, all possessing that same central tenet. However, we have also seen some events that, while being atypical, could still constitute a rebellion. The prime example of this is the Civil Rights Movement. In our group's view, the long-standing violation of laws in the form of civil disobedience makes the Civil Rights Movement a rebellion of its own.
Furthermore, while many rebellions are violent, it is not inherent nor necessary for one to be so. What makes something a rebellion is the engagement of sustained collective action against an authority, through either armed insurgency or civil resistance.
The largest purpose of rebellions in American history is to make us question both constitutional and natural higher law. Take, for example, the Whiskey Rebellion. The rebels here believe they have been fighting for the same ideal as the American Revolution: no taxation without representation. The outrage provoked Washington into enacting the Militia Act of 1792, marching nearly 13,000 troops to quell the rebellion, bringing into question how far Washington's Article 2, Section 1, oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, and the Take Care Clause of Article 2, Section 3 really extend. We can see the same with Nat Turner's Rebellion, making us question, is slavery consistent with our founding principles of all people are created equal? And as well in Shays' Rebellion, making us question the efficacy of the Articles of the Confederation.
Recently, we have seen huge swaths of Americans believe that the 2020 presidential election was fraudulent. These feelings led the Trump campaign to bring over 60 lawsuits, losing all but one of them. All of this culminated in the events of January 6th. While calling January 6th a coup versus a rebellion or an insurrection might just seem like trifling nomenclature, in reality, this can have huge ramifications considering Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. The authors of the 14th Amendment intended to ban former government officials that joined the South Rebellion from serving in office again. Its relevance was brought back into question by the January 6th insurrection.
In our group's view, the events of January 6th narrowly miss our definition of a rebellion. The event was organized on platforms like Parler and had the political unrest component, as they have been attempting to prevent the electoral vote count ordained in the 12th Amendment. However, the events missed the sustained portion of our definition, as they only lasted a few hours. And for that reason, we can believe it can better be described as an insurrection, notably still allowing consideration of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment.
In order to evaluate whether or not a rebellion is justified, we've created a three-pronged test. Whether those rebelling have faced a long train of abuses, whether the rebels' actions are narrow and targeted towards the cause of their abuse, and whether there was no hope to peacefully remedy their grievances.
And we can use that test to distinguish between the rebellions of the 21st century. Using our criteria, we can easily determine that ISIS is not justified because they claim abuse from American imperialism, yet commit atrocities like massacring droves of Middle Eastern civilians who clearly are not the cause of their perceived long train of abuses.
But there are rebellions that fit our standards. The Kurdish rebels in the Middle East have faced a long train of abuses in that their consent of the governed has been violated, and the rebellion is clearly rooted in those grievances that they have.
Justifying that earlier description of bellow can be hard and shouldn't be used except for in very particular times, but it can be used to make very powerful changes. Thank you, and we stand ready for your questions.
Take the position of those who were the most extreme of the demonstrators on January 6th. How do you suppose they would defend themselves and explain their behavior to their children and grandchildren?
Excuse me, could you repeat the question?
Yes, how would the demonstrators of January 6th define themselves or explain themselves to their children and grandchildren? What's their justification?
I think the issue is that when they explain themselves to their children or grandchildren, they very well might just feel the exact same way as they do today, because they just are in such a political bubble that they're not able to see out of that and see that they are just incorrect.
And the reality is that they would likely explain that they believe they were justified because they believe Donald Trump won the election. And we have to combat that by pointing out simple facts that were explained in cases like Trump versus Kemp and the 11th Circuit in Georgia, where the judge simply said that unequivocally all of the claims brought by the Trump administration against the election of Georgia were completely invalid and did not have a basis in legality in Georgia at all.
And I also think we really have to note the intense polarization of this issue. Many of these people truly do believe that these elections were fraudulent. They truly do think this. And I think we get to the root of the problem when we think about the fact that this is not just something they have thought or seen. This is something that their own president at the time had stated.
I very much appreciated that you referred to Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. Can you tell me how it might be applied today as we're going forward dealing with the January 6th investigation?
So the first place that I would look for Section 3 of the 14th Amendment to be applied is in Congress. Expressly in the 14th Amendment, it mentions 2/3. And we also know that from Article 1, Section 5, Congress also has the power to expel their own members. The other place that you could see it take place is in the states, as under Article 1, Section 4, they have the time, place, and manner clause to run their own elections. And you actually have seen that recently with Marjorie Taylor Greene testifying in court on Friday. And if they come to a verdict on that, it's possible they would recommend to remove her from the ballot.
And I may differ from my colleagues in this, but I think using Section 3 of the 14th Amendment in regards to January 6th might not be in order. And I think because it was made as an ex post facto law in order to punish the South and those who worked in the South, I think applying it in January 6th, which is just such a far different case that had far different actors that were there for far different reasons, might not be in order.
Interesting. And I'm also interested in the difference that you seem to be pointing out between a coup and a rebellion or an insurrection. That a coup would not be included under the statutes?
It is not necessarily not included. The point that we make is just that Congress or the states have to make that decision for themselves. The language in the 14th Amendment is rebellion or insurrection or aided the enemies of the United States. And we believe that this is meant to be a little vague so that at the time of the day, we can decide what it means to us.
And I think it was particularly vague because they were simply trying to punish those in the South who helped the Confederacy, and they weren't entirely interested in these set of vaguely not very well-defined words being used in the future.
So you don't, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was to say, I also think that this terminology being used is extremely difficult because at the time, it's very hard to label these things. I think January 6th is a very good example of this. At the time, it was being called all sorts of things. It was being called a revolt, an insurrection, a rebellion. And we didn't really know until 2 months-ish later that it actually was considered a rebellion in popularized terms.
Well, wait, let me just ask you, and part of what's generating this, the foundation of what I'm asking about is, it's not as though that was the 2020 election were the last one. Well, we got others that are going to be coming up. And so part of what I want to know is how do we keep this from happening again? And what is generating that question, given the position you're taking that, you know, they were trying to mess with the South, well, why wouldn't we want to warn people, don't start that stuff? There are prices you will pay.
So I'm going to go ahead and answer the first part of your question on how do we prevent this going forward. And I would look to combat the spread of misinformation. One issue with this is that it can be very hard to punish misinformation. I'd look to the case New York Times v. Sullivan. While that is specifically about libel, they found you can only censure stuff like libel and misinformation if you can prove that there was malice behind the action. The other thing I'd look to is addressing polarization.
I completely contend with what my colleague is saying, because we can look at how to punish those in January 6th, and that is important, but we have to get to the root of it as to why they were there. And why they were there is because of deep-rooted polarization in our country, and it's because of misinformation that spread across platforms like Twitter and platforms like Facebook and platforms like Parler.
And I also think it's very important to note that I think it's up to us as the citizens to prevent the spread of false speech. And we can look at some Supreme Court quotes to back this up. For example, Justice Kennedy in United States versus Alvarez said that the remedy to false speech is true speech. And ultimately that it is up to us as the citizens to not only inform ourselves and educate ourselves, but educate those around us as well.
To what degree should government try to limit information and free speech in order to avoid some of this polarization that we have?
So I would actually be very worried when government is trying to limit misinformation. And I'd actually look at a precedent that the government has set for themselves, RAV versus City of St. Paul, in which the government essentially said they can't take sides in a debate. This was specifically related. They said, we can't censure anti-Semite speech more than we would censure people protesting for Jewish rights, just because the government can't take a side in debates.
But just because the government can't take a side doesn't mean that no one can take a side. A lot of this speech that happened was on private platforms. And as we can see in Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which affirms that private platforms have the ability to patrol speech on their platforms, that we can see that Twitter and Facebook may have taken a role themselves to try and limit this misinformation that led to January 6th in the first place.
And I also think that having a strong president willing to combat issues like this is extremely important. And unfortunately, in January 6th, we did have a president who was perpetuating the issue. But I think looking to Hamilton's Federalist 70, energy in the executive, is extremely important. The president has a lot of authority over the beliefs of its citizens. I think we definitely saw that in January 6th. I think it's a very important role that they play.
Okay, I'd kind of like to go back. All right, go back for a second to the.
Excuse me, I made a mistake. You have more than 1 minute.
Okay. Going back a little bit to the 14th Amendment, did I understand you to suggest that you don't think that anybody who in government office should be prevented from trying again because this was not like the Civil War and that was only about punishing?
Well, I answered that, and I may differ from my colleagues in that answer, but my answer was based on the fact of how vaguely and loosely defined rebellion and insurrection are in the 14th Amendment, and how they were intended to be defined against the South to punish those who served in the Confederacy.
I would disagree with my colleague. I think we have to apply the same standard to the Constitution throughout time. And I'd also look to the fact that we have passed insurrection acts throughout our history, like in 1835, to expressly deal with insurrections in the future.
And while the Civil War was implied within that, I still think that the implication does not really matter that much. The text there is still an insurrection. And if we define January 6th as an insurrection, then it should be handled as such.
Okay. Lindsay? Or Steve?
Okay, how can we change government without rebellion?
So that's kind of what we talked about in our opening statement, just very briefly. We mentioned that before rebellion, we want to see people take all of the peaceful possible remedies that they have. So I would look for people to use their First Amendment rights of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and stuff to try and make a change, both in the legislative body and among the views of the people.
And for us to encourage voting and for us to encourage civic participation, which can lead to changes in those who are in our legislative bodies, those who are in our executive bodies, and for long-term change that doesn't involve rebellion, knowing that sometimes when we can't have that happen, rebellion might be justified.
I also think that the advocation and spread of speech through social media is vital to changing our government. I think we live in a time where we have the ability to promote things and encourage things that we want change about, and to promote and organize, like on platforms like Parler, unfortunately, in that instance. But we have the advocation to do so now, and I think we really need to utilize that.
And how briefly could young people like you reach out to some older folks who don't know how to listen to other people, but would rather talk? What can you do?
I would look to stuff like what we did in relation to the Parkland school shootings. I know, for example, my school organized a 17-minute long walkout for the 17 victims of the Parkland school shootings, and that movement nationwide garnered much media attention.
I also think educating ourselves is extremely important. I think we've kind of led to this belief that only adults are able to educate themselves and spread correct information, but we ourselves have access to social media and access to programs like this where we can spread correct information.
And thank God for that. Congratulations. That was really a lovely job. Thank you very much. Steve, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I thought that you gave us some good historical background, some good definitions. I like the fact that you tried to get at the root causes of the problem. I think that's important. Overall, I thought you did an excellent job.
Lindsay?
You know, I'm really glad you slipped in that little piece there at the end that said, you think you all are the only ones who can do some educating. We can do it, but we can also take some action and we can get attention. And maybe by getting positive attention, we can get the ears and the eyes of some folks who don't seem to know how to pay attention. Really, you just changed my mood by just that by itself. So thank you very much.
I think that was a really lovely job, really interesting and very good responses to my questions. I really appreciated what you had to say, and when we came back to it, you went further. You peeled the onion a little more, and you showed 1835 Insurrection Act. I mean, you just really showed that you knew more than you were giving us right now, and just makes me want to continue our conversation way past 10 minutes, which is already way past 6 minutes or from the weekend. So thank you for a really lovely experience. And I hope that you use this experience yourselves. We don't know what you're interested in, but if any one of you decide that you'd like to represent us in Congress or work for the government, we need people who know what they're doing, and it would be very nice to know that you're taking over for our generation, because it's well time. So thank you very much. I hope you've had a great time doing this.
Thank you so
very
much
much as well.